Imagine standing in the heart of ancient Rome, where marble columns pierce the sky and the Senate's voices echo through stone corridors. Now imagine that same Rome trembling, not before barbarian armies or natural disasters, but before a single woman. A woman barely past her teenage years, who held no official title, commanded no legions, yet brought the world's greatest empire to its knees. Her name was Valeria Messalina, and this is not a tale of love or heroism. This is a story of how absolute power, when placed in hands unprepared for its weight, can transform ambition into obsession, influence into tyranny, and a palace into a theater of shadows where morality itself becomes negotiable. What you're about to hear has been buried beneath 2,000 years of history, censored by emperors, debated by scholars, and whispered in corridors where even walls had ears. But today, we uncover the truth. The year is 38 AD. In a grand villa overlooking Rome's 7 hills, a marriage ceremony unfolds. The bride is barely 15 years old, Valeria Messalina, descended from the most prestigious bloodline in Roman history, connected by ancestry to Augustus himself, the founder of the empire. Her beauty is already legendary. Poets will later struggle to capture it in words. Dark eyes that seem to see through deception, skin like polished marble, a presence that commands attention without uttering a single syllable. The groom standing beside her is Claudius, a man 28 years her senior, often mocked by Rome's elite for his physical disabilities, his stammering speech, his bookish nature that seems unfit for the brutal world of imperial politics. To the wedding guests sipping wine and offering congratulations, this seems like just another political alliance, another marriage arranged to strengthen family connections and secure bloodlines. But they don't see what burns behind Messalina's eyes. They don't hear the calculations already forming in her brilliant, restless mind. She understands something that Rome's senators and generals have forgotten in their comfortable certainty. The empire no longer belongs to those who can fight. It belongs to those who can manipulate. Before we continue this journey through Rome's darkest chapter, I want to ask you something. If you're fascinated by history's hidden stories, by the real people behind the legends, then subscribe to this channel. 3 years pass. Messalina moves through the imperial household like a shadow, watching, learning, waiting. Then, on January 24th, 41 AD, everything changes in the span of a single afternoon. Emperor Caligula, the mad tyrant whose cruelty has terrorized Rome for 4 years, is assassinated by his own Praetorian guards in an underground corridor of the palace. The Senate, seeing an opportunity to restore the Republic, begins debating the future of Rome. But while politicians argue, soldiers act. The Praetorian Guard discovers Claudius hiding behind a curtain in the palace, terrified that he'll be killed along with the rest of the imperial family. But these soldiers see opportunity in an unexpected place. They proclaim Claudius emperor, not because they respect him, but because they know he'll be dependent on their support. He'll be easy to control, or so they think. When Messalina receives the news that her husband is now emperor of Rome, she doesn't celebrate. She doesn't rejoice. She simply closes her eyes and allows herself one small smile. At 18 years old, she has become Augusta, empress of the known world. The palace staff expects her to behave like previous empresses, to patronize temples, to attend public ceremonies, to smile gracefully and speak softly while men make decisions. They expect her to be decorative, dutiful, invisible, except when needed for official appearances. They have no idea what's coming. Messalina begins slowly, carefully, like a master architect laying foundations for a structure whose full dimensions only she can envision. Her first moves seem innocent, replacing a few servants here, reorganizing palace security there, establishing new protocols for who can access which areas of the imperial complex. But each small change serves a larger purpose. The servants she dismisses are those too loyal to old traditions, too likely to report unusual activities to Senate allies or military commanders. The ones she brings in are chosen for their flexibility, their willingness to look away, their understanding that in this new Rome, loyalty to the Empress matters more than loyalty to abstract principles. She redesigns entire sections of the palace. Official records show expenditures for renovations and improvements to imperial quarters. In reality, she's creating a labyrinth within the palace, chambers that don't appear on official maps, corridors connecting buildings in ways that bypass normal guard posts, rooms whose purposes are known only to her inner circle. Why? Because Messalina understands that knowledge is power, and the most valuable knowledge comes from what people do when they believe no one is watching. She begins hosting private gatherings. At first, they seem like ordinary social events. Senators and their wives invited for dinner, military commanders honored with intimate receptions, wealthy merchants given audiences with the Empress. The wine flows freely. Entertainment is provided. Conversations range across politics, philosophy, gossip. But these gatherings have a purpose beyond socializing. Messalina watches. She learns who drinks too much and what secrets they reveal. She discovers which senators can be flattered into indiscretion, which commanders prioritize personal advancement over duty, which merchants will bend laws for profit. She creates files in her mind, invisible dossiers on every important person in Rome. And slowly, carefully, she begins to use this knowledge. Within a year of Claudius becoming emperor, something unprecedented begins happening in Roman politics. Decisions that should take weeks of Senate debate are made overnight. Military appointments that should be based on merit go to unexpected candidates. Trade agreements that should benefit Rome's treasury somehow enrich specific individuals. And at the center of it all, invisible to casual observation, sits Messalina. She never gives direct orders. She never appears at Senate meetings. She operates through suggestion, through carefully placed words, through the network of obligations she's been building since the day she became empress. A senator who needs support for legislation finds himself invited to a private dinner with the empress. The conversation is pleasant, cultured, seemingly innocent. But embedded in the pleasantries are subtle references to information Messalina possesses, information that could embarrass the senator's family, damage his reputation, or worse. The senator doesn't need to be threatened explicitly. He understands. When the Empress's representatives approach him later with requests, he knows what answer is expected. A military commander hoping for promotion discovers that his advancement depends on certain favors, not bribes. Rome's system already runs on those. Something more personal, more compromising. Once granted, that favor becomes invisible chains binding him to the Empress's service. He'll support her interests, promote her allies, eliminate her obstacles, because the alternative is exposure and disgrace. Messalina doesn't just corrupt individuals. She corrupts systems. She identifies key positions in Rome's bureaucracy, treasury officials who approve expenditures, judges who decide legal cases, priests who grant religious sanctions, and systematically places her people in these roles. Or she compromises the existing occupants until they become her people. The genius of her approach is its subtlety. To most Romans, everything appears normal. The Senate still meets, laws are still passed, the empire still functions. But underneath the surface, a parallel power structure has emerged with Messalina at its apex, pulling strings that most people don't even realize exist. But power, especially power exercised in shadows, has a corrosive effect on those who wield it. And absolute power, as history repeatedly teaches, corrupts absolutely. By 43 AD, Messalina's behavior begins to change. The careful subtlety that marked her early maneuvers gives way to increasing boldness. She no longer bothers to hide certain activities from palace staff. She dismisses advisors who counsel restraint. She surrounds herself with enablers who encourage her worst impulses rather than checking them. Reports begin circulating through Rome, whispered at first, then spoken more openly, about the Empress's nocturnal activities. Some claim she's been seen in disguise in Rome's less reputable districts, not as observer but as participant. Others speak of parties within the palace that last until dawn, parties from which certain guests emerge looking traumatized and refuse to discuss what occurred. The Roman aristocracy doesn't quite know what to make of these rumors. Are they slander spread by political enemies, exaggeration of innocent events, or terrible truths that no one wants to acknowledge because acknowledging them would require action no one wants to take? Claudius, when asked about his wife's activities, either deflects the questions or seems genuinely unaware. His advisors debate among themselves whether the emperor truly doesn't know, or whether he knows but feels powerless to act, or whether he's chosen willful ignorance as the safest path. Because by this point, Messalina's network is so extensive, her leverage over so many powerful people so complete, that moving against her would be extraordinarily dangerous. She's compromised senators, commanders, officials throughout the empire. If she were to be arrested or exiled, what might she reveal? How many reputations would she destroy in her fall? So Rome enters a strange period where everyone knows something is wrong, but no one quite dares to confront it directly. Messalina's true genius lies not in her personal activities, but in how she weaponizes information and reputation against those who might oppose her. Consider the case of Decimus Valerius Asiaticus, one of Rome's wealthiest senators, a man of impeccable reputation, owner of the legendary gardens of Lucullus, one of the most beautiful estates in Italy. By all accounts, Asiaticus is everything a Roman senator should be: dignified, honorable, loyal to the state. But he makes one critical mistake. He possesses something Messalina wants: those magnificent gardens. What happens next demonstrates the Empress's methods with chilling clarity. Asiaticus doesn't insult her. He doesn't challenge her politically. He simply exists as an obstacle to her desire. Messalina begins planting seeds of suspicion. Whispers reach Claudius's ears, carefully orchestrated whispers, that Asiaticus harbors secret ambitions for the throne, that he's been meeting with military commanders, that he's amassed weapons and gold, that he's committed adultery with important women, violations of Roman morality that could provide legal grounds for prosecution. None of it is true. But Messalina has learned that truth matters less than perception, especially when you control who whispers into the emperor's ear. Asiaticus is brought to trial. He defends himself eloquently, with dignity and logic that should convince any impartial observer of his innocence. But the trial isn't impartial. The outcome was decided before it began. Asiaticus, understanding that his fate is sealed, chooses the Roman option: suicide. He dies with honor on his own terms, but his property is immediately confiscated. The gardens of Lucullus become Messalina's possession, and to celebrate her acquisition, she hosts a lavish party in those very gardens, on the ground still stained with her victim's blood. The message to Rome's elite is unmistakable: no one is safe. Honor is no protection. Reputation is no shield. The Empress takes what she wants, and opposition is fatal. Asiaticus's destruction is not an isolated incident. It's a template that Messalina will use repeatedly over the following years. Gaius Appius Silanus, a respected senator who had briefly been married to Messalina's own mother, meets a similar fate. When he declines the Empress's inappropriate advances, perhaps out of respect for his former connection to her family, perhaps from simple moral conviction, he signs his death warrant. Messalina convinces Claudius that Silanus is plotting against him. Dreams are fabricated. Romans take dreams seriously as divine messages. Witnesses are coached. Evidence is manufactured. Silanus is executed in 42 AD, his property seized, his name blackened. The pattern repeats with sickening regularity. Any senator wealthy enough to be worth plundering, any commander independent enough to be threatening, any official principled enough to resist corruption, all become targets. Some are accused of treason, others of sexual impropriety. Still others simply disappear, their bodies found in the Tiber River or never found at all. Messalina develops a particular cruelty in her methods. She doesn't just kill her enemies. She humiliates them first. She destroys their reputations so thoroughly that even their deaths cannot restore their honor. She forces them to betray their own principles, to compromise themselves in ways that make their eventual destruction seem almost justified to observers. The psychological impact on Rome's elite is devastating. Aristocrats who once walked the forum with proud certainty now move cautiously, always watching, always wondering if they've inadvertently attracted the empress's attention. Senators who once debated policy with passionate conviction now speak in careful platitudes, afraid that any strong opinion might be interpreted as opposition. Trust evaporates. If Messalina can compromise anyone, then who can be trusted? That senator who seems friendly, has he been turned into an informant? That commander who offers alliance, is he genuine or testing loyalty for the empress? Paranoia becomes rational. Suspicion becomes survival strategy. While individual destructions grab attention, Messalina's more lasting damage comes from her systematic corruption of Rome's institutions. The Senate, theoretically the heart of Roman government, becomes a theatrical performance where real decisions are made elsewhere. Senators go through motions of debate, knowing that outcomes have been predetermined by the empress's network. Legislation is drafted not based on what benefits Rome, but on what enriches Messalina's allies and punishes her enemies. The treasury becomes a personal piggy bank. Official records show massive expenditures for imperial improvements and state necessities. In reality, gold flows to the empress's projects, her renovations, her parties, her bribes, her payments to the network of informants and enforcers who maintain her power. When officials question irregularities, they're invited to the palace for discussions. They emerge either as co-conspirators or as broken individuals who have learned not to ask questions. The few who persist in demanding accountability meet unfortunate accidents or sudden retirements or mysterious illnesses. The military, Rome's traditional source of power and stability, proves surprisingly vulnerable to Messalina's influence. Officers discover that promotions depend less on battlefield competence and more on personal loyalty to the empress. Commands are bought and sold. Discipline erodes as those connected to Messalina operate with impunity, while those who maintain traditional standards find themselves sidelined. Even Rome's religious institutions fall under her sway. Priests who should be above political influence discover that their positions depend on the empress's favor. Religious sanctions that should be granted based on tradition and propriety are instead traded like any other commodity. The gods themselves, in whose names Rome's actions are theoretically justified, become props in Messalina's theater of power. The cumulative effect is a government that looks functional from outside but is rotting from within. Rome still appears to be Rome. Senate meetings, military parades, religious ceremonies all continue. But the substance behind the appearance has been hollowed out, replaced by a system designed to serve one person's interests while maintaining the illusion of traditional order. Messalina doesn't just want power, she wants worship. Among certain segments of Roman society, particularly those who have most benefited from her patronage, or most enjoyed the license she offers, something resembling a cult begins to form around the empress. These aren't her victims or those she's coerced. These are true believers, people who see in Messalina a liberating force, someone who challenges Rome's rigid hierarchies and ancient hypocrisies. They gather in secret locations throughout the city, conducting ceremonies that blend religious ritual with personal devotion to the empress. Shrines appear in private homes. Temples officially dedicated to traditional gods contain hidden alcoves honoring Messalina. Poetry is written celebrating her as a living goddess who transcends mortal limitations. These devotees don't see corruption or tyranny. They see freedom, power, the possibility of a Rome remade in the empress's image. Messalina encourages this worship carefully. She makes appearances at select gatherings, sometimes revealed, sometimes remaining masked and mysterious. She grants favors to the most fervent believers. She creates an inner circle of true devotees who compete for her attention and approval. This cult serves multiple purposes. It provides Messalina with fanatically loyal followers who will do anything for her. It creates networks that operate outside normal Roman social structures, making them harder for traditional authorities to infiltrate or control. And psychologically, it feeds her growing conviction that she truly is above normal rules, that ordinary morality doesn't apply to someone of her extraordinary nature. Ancient historians, particularly Christian writers recording events decades later, will cite these cult activities as evidence of pagan Rome's spiritual bankruptcy. But even contemporary Roman sources, written by polytheistic believers, express discomfort with how Messalina merges worship with personal power, creating something that feels less like traditional religion and more like organized psychological manipulation. Messalina's influence extends far beyond Rome's city walls. She understands that an empire cannot be controlled from the capital alone. Provincial governors, the men who actually administer Rome's vast territories, must be either allies or tools. Appointments to provincial governorships become exercises in patronage. Competent administrators who might govern independently are passed over in favor of those who owe their positions to Messalina's support. These governors understand that their continued authority depends on regular demonstrations of loyalty, shipments of local treasures to Rome, favorable decisions in disputes involving the empress's business interests. Blind eyes turn to the activities of her agents in their territories. Foreign dignitaries arriving in Rome for negotiations find themselves dealing not just with official Roman representatives, but with the empress's intermediaries. Trade agreements, diplomatic recognitions, military alliances, all are filtered through Messalina's network. She inserts herself into relationships between Rome and its subject peoples, becoming a chokepoint through which all provincial business must flow. The financial implications are staggering. Taxes that should fill Rome's treasury are diverted. Resources that should support legions on distant frontiers are redirected to the empress's projects. The empire's infrastructure of roads, aqueducts, and fortifications, maintained by previous emperors with careful attention, begins to deteriorate as funding disappears into Messalina's network of corruption. Yet remarkably, for several years this system works. Rome's external enemies remain disorganized. The provinces, while exploited, don't rebel. The military, though corrupted at the top, retains enough strength at the operational level to maintain order. Messalina has created a parasitic system that drains the empire without quite killing it, at least not immediately. Throughout all of this, one question haunts historians. What did Claudius know, and when did he know it? The emperor is not stupid. Despite the mockery he endured before gaining power, Claudius is genuinely intelligent, a capable administrator who has written respected historical works, who understands government machinery, who manages many aspects of imperial business competently. Yet regarding his wife's activities, he seems willfully blind, or perhaps not willfully but desperately. Because by 45 AD, 3 years into his reign, Claudius faces an impossible situation. If he confronts Messalina directly, he risks civil war. She's compromised so many powerful people that they have a vested interest in protecting her. If she falls, she might reveal their secrets. They could unite against the emperor to prevent their own exposure. If he attempts to arrest her, he risks assassination. Messalina's network includes palace guards, personal attendants, even some of his own advisors. How can he move against her when he can't be certain who around him is truly loyal? If he publicly acknowledges her behavior, he humiliates himself. In Roman culture, a man's honor depends partly on his ability to control his household. An emperor who cannot control his own wife is an emperor who invites contempt and rebellion. So Claudius adopts a strategy of careful ignorance. He focuses on aspects of government where he can still function: legal reforms, infrastructure projects, military campaigns in Britain that give him glory independent of his wife. He surrounds himself with capable freedmen, former slaves who have risen to administrative positions and who owe their status entirely to him, rather than to aristocratic connections Messalina might exploit. But this strategy has limits. The empire cannot indefinitely sustain two parallel power structures, one official and one shadow. Eventually, something will force a reckoning. Scene 12. The warning signs. By 47 AD, cracks begin appearing in Messalina's carefully constructed system. She's becoming increasingly reckless, emboldened by years of operating without consequences, convinced of her own invincibility. Her financial demands grow more extreme. The treasury is being drained so rapidly that even friendly officials express concern. Infrastructure projects are delayed or canceled for lack of funds. Military commanders report problems supplying distant legions. The empire's fiscal health, which depends on careful management of limited resources, is deteriorating visibly. Her enemies, forced underground by terror, begin finding ways to communicate with each other. Secret meetings occur where senators discuss what can be done. Messages pass between military commanders wondering whether the army might need to intervene. Even within Messalina's own network, some begin questioning whether they've tied themselves to someone whose self-destruction is inevitable and will take them down with her. The Empress responds to these stirrings of resistance with escalating violence. More senators are executed, more property is confiscated, more people simply disappear. But force alone cannot indefinitely sustain a system built on corruption and fear. Each new victim creates new grievances. Each seized property makes more enemies. Each execution reminds others that they might be next. Claudius's freedmen advisors, particularly Narcissus, the emperor's secretary, and Pallas, his financial administrator, begin cautiously collecting evidence of Messalina's activities. They cannot move openly while she remains powerful, but they prepare for the moment when opportunity might arise to present the emperor with proof he cannot ignore. That moment comes in the autumn of 48 AD, and it comes in a form so bizarre, so inexplicable, that historians still debate whether they've understood events correctly. Messalina falls in love, or something resembling love, perhaps obsession, perhaps a twisted desire to possess completely rather than merely compromise and control. The object of her fixation is Gaius Silius, a senator renowned as one of the most handsome men in Rome. This is not one of her calculated seductions designed to gain leverage. Ancient sources suggest something different: genuine passion, overwhelming attraction, emotion rather than strategy. Silius is married, but Messalina forces his divorce. She lavishes gifts on him with such extravagance that even in a city accustomed to imperial excess, people notice and gossip. She appears with him publicly, making no effort to hide their relationship despite still being married to the emperor. Her inner circle grows alarmed. Some try to counsel restraint, to remind her that she's approaching a line that even she cannot cross with impunity. But Messalina, after 7 years of unlimited power, believes herself beyond all boundaries. Then comes the act that will destroy her. While Claudius is away from Rome at the port of Ostia inspecting grain shipments, Messalina stages a wedding ceremony with Silius. An actual wedding, with official witnesses, signed contracts, religious rituals, public celebration. Historians debate her motivation. Some argue she planned to overthrow Claudius and place Silius on the throne, ruling through him as she couldn't rule directly. Others suggest she was so infatuated that she simply wanted to be truly married to the man she loved. Consequences be damned. Still others propose this was some elaborate religious ceremony connected to the cult of Bacchus, though this explanation seems designed to make sense of the senseless. Whatever her reasoning, the wedding is celebrated at Silius's villa. Witnesses attend and offer congratulations. Wine flows freely. Entertainment is provided. For several hours, Messalina apparently convinces herself that this is not treason, but simply another demonstration of her transcendence of ordinary rules. But this time, she has miscalculated catastrophically. News reaches Claudius almost immediately through multiple channels. Narcissus, seeing the opportunity he's been waiting for, ensures that the emperor cannot possibly ignore or rationalize what has occurred. This is not rumor. This is not exaggeration. This is documented fact witnessed by dozens of people. The empress has married another man while the emperor still lives. In Roman law, this is not merely adultery. This is treason. This is an implicit claim that Claudius's authority no longer exists. Narcissus frames the situation in the starkest terms. Silius plans to assume the throne with Messalina's corrupted network supporting him. Whether this is true becomes irrelevant. It's plausible enough to overcome Claudius's years of denial and avoidance. The emperor returns to Rome immediately, accompanied by the Praetorian Guard whose loyalty Narcissus has secured. The speed and decisiveness of the response suggests that once mobilized, imperial authority still functions. Messalina has corrupted much, but not everything. The Praetorian Guard surrounds Silius's villa where the wedding celebration continues, now descended into drunken revelry as evening approaches. The arrests are swift and brutal. Silius is executed immediately, denied even a show trial. Others present at the wedding meet similar fates, particularly those holding official positions whose participation can be construed as treason. The bloodletting extends beyond the villa as Claudius's administration moves to eliminate anyone closely associated with Messalina's inner circle. In a single day, the network she spent 7 years building collapses. Allies abandon her. Supporters flee or beg for mercy. Those she compromised suddenly remember their loyalty to the emperor and offer to testify against her. The seemingly invincible empress discovers that power built on fear and blackmail evaporates the moment that fear shifts direction. Messalina flees to the gardens of Lucullus. Ironically, the same property she seized from Valerius Asiaticus after engineering his death. She seems to finally grasp that her immunity has ended and her life is in immediate danger. According to Tacitus, who recorded events based on testimony from those present, Messalina attempts to compose a petition for mercy, but her usual facility with words fails her. The woman who manipulated countless people through careful language finds herself unable to articulate a defense. She tries to reach her children, Octavia and Britannicus, hoping their presence might soften Claudius's heart. She considers various escape plans, fleeing to the provinces where friendly governors might shelter her, seeking sanctuary in a temple where religious law might protect her, gathering loyal followers for armed resistance. But time has run out. The Praetorian Guard reaches the gardens before any escape plan can be implemented. Messalina is in the gardens with her mother, Domitia Lepida, who has come despite their estrangement to be with her daughter at the end. The tribune commanding the execution squad is unmoved by Messalina's pleas or her mother's intercession. Ancient sources describe her attempting suicide but lacking the courage. Her mother urges her to die with dignity rather than be dragged through Rome streets. In the end, the tribune's sword finishes what Messalina cannot complete. She dies in 48 AD at approximately 28 years old, having been empress for 7 years. Her body is given to her mother for burial, a small mercy that Claudius grants, but her name receives no such kindness. The Senate, convening in emergency session, passes a formal damnatio memoriae, condemnation of memory. Every inscription bearing Messalina's name is ordered chiseled away. Every statue of her is to be pulled down and destroyed. Official records are expunged. Speaking her name positively becomes a crime. Throughout Rome and across the provinces, stone workers begin the labor of erasure. On monuments, temples, public buildings, anywhere the empress's name appears, chisels strike marble and bronze. Within weeks, physical evidence of her existence largely disappears, but memory proves harder to erase than stone. Too many people know what happened. Too many families lost members to her schemes. Too many officials were compromised. Too many fortunes were seized. The whispers persist in Rome's streets and Senate chambers. Claudius himself seems psychologically damaged by the revelation of his wife's activities and betrayal. Ancient sources record a disturbing moment. At dinner shortly after her execution, he asks why the empress hasn't joined him, either forgetting temporarily or unable to process what occurred. His advisors gently remind him, and he falls silent. The emperor remarries within a year to his niece Agrippina, who proves equally ambitious but more politically astute. Agrippina eventually poisons Claudius and secures the throne for her son Nero, beginning another chapter of imperial dysfunction. Messalina's children face tragic fates. Octavia is married to Nero and later executed on fabricated charges. Britannicus, who should have been Claudius's heir, is poisoned by Nero shortly after Claudius's death. Neither survives to adulthood. The sins of the mother are visited upon her children through the machinations of Roman politics. 2,000 years later, historians still argue about Messalina. How much of what ancient sources recorded was true? How much was exaggerated by writers with political agendas or moral lessons to teach? The primary sources, Tacitus, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, were all writing decades after events, relying on earlier records and testimonies from those who lived through the period. They wrote in a deeply patriarchal society that often used sexual scandal to discredit powerful women. Female ambition was threatening. Presenting ambitious women as sexually depraved reinforced social norms about women's proper place. Yet the remarkable consistency across multiple independent sources, the specific nature of their claims, and corroborating evidence from inscriptions and contemporary documents suggest a core of truth beneath whatever embellishment occurred. The archaeological record confirms that Messalina existed, held power, was executed, and suffered damnatio memoriae. Buildings were modified during her reign. Fortunes changed hands. People died. Modern scholars attempt to understand Messalina in context. She lived in a society where women of the imperial family had almost no formal power but tremendous informal influence. She watched Livia, Augustus's wife, manipulate politics from behind the scenes for decades. She lived through Caligula's reign, where traditional boundaries dissolved and excess became normalized. Perhaps she internalized the lesson that in Rome, power flowed to those willing to be most ruthless and most willing to violate taboos. Her tragedy was pushing too far, too fast, alienating too many powerful people who eventually found a way to destroy her. The psychological profile that emerges suggests someone highly intelligent, strategically brilliant, utterly lacking in empathy for her victims, and increasingly unable to recognize boundaries. In modern terms, we might recognize patterns associated with narcissistic personality disorder or psychopathy, grandiose self-image, manipulation without remorse, inability to feel empathy, impulsive decision-making despite obvious dangers. But diagnosing people across 2 millennia is speculative at best. What remains certain is that Messalina possessed exceptional intelligence that kept her in power for 7 years despite behavior that would have destroyed lesser players immediately, combined with profound moral blindness that ultimately led to her destruction. Messalina's most lasting damage wasn't personal destruction of individuals, but systemic corruption of institutions that took generations to repair. The Senate never fully recovered its independence. Having learned to be subservient, having watched principle punished and compromise rewarded, senators became more cautious, more willing to defer to imperial authority even when that authority was exercised poorly. The treasury's looting left Rome financially vulnerable. Infrastructure projects delayed during Messalina's reign remained unfinished for years. Military preparedness suffered as funds diverted to corruption meant equipment not purchased, fortifications not maintained, supplies not delivered to distant frontiers. Trust within Rome's elite eroded permanently. If Messalina could compromise anyone, then who could be trusted? That paranoia persisted long after her death, making cooperation more difficult, alliances more fragile, collective action harder to organize. Provincial administration remained corrupted for years as governors appointed for loyalty, rather than competence continued in office. The merit-based system that had made Rome great gave way to patronage networks that prioritized personal connections over capability. Perhaps most significantly, Messalina's reign demonstrated the fundamental weakness in Rome's imperial system. The Principate, the governmental structure established by Augustus, depended on the emperor and his family behaving with at least nominal respect for tradition and law. But what happened when they didn't? What mechanisms existed to check imperial family members who decided that power meant immunity from all rules? The answer, as Messalina proved, was very few effective mechanisms. Only when she pushed so far that even her supporters couldn't defend her, only when she committed an act, bigamous marriage, so blatant that it couldn't be ignored or rationalized, did the system finally respond. But by then, enormous damage had been done. Messalina's name became synonymous with female excess and moral corruption. Within years of her death, Roman playwrights incorporated references to her in satires. Graffiti in Pompeii and other cities used her name as crude insult. To call someone a Messalina was to deliver a devastating condemnation. This cultural legacy persisted through centuries. Christian writers found in her story perfect ammunition for arguments about pagan Rome's moral bankruptcy. Medieval morality tales featured characters based on her. Renaissance artists depicted her in paintings combining titillation with moral lessons about unchecked ambition and lust. Each era remade Messalina according to its own preoccupations. Victorian historians, deeply uncomfortable with female sexuality, emphasized her depravity while downplaying her political intelligence. Early feminist scholars argued she was slandered by patriarchal sources threatened by powerful women. More recent historians attempt nuanced readings acknowledging both that sources were biased and that Messalina genuinely abused power in horrific ways. The empress who worked so hard to build a cult around herself ended up becoming an inverted icon, a figure of worship transformed into figure of condemnation. Her name preserved precisely because it serves as warning rather than inspiration. Modern Rome hides ancient Rome beneath layers of construction and time, but occasionally, archaeology reveals hints of Messalina's reign. Excavations on the Palatine Hill have mapped extensive tunnel systems beneath the imperial palace. Some sections date to Messalina's era and align with ancient descriptions of secret passages she supposedly had constructed. Walking through these tunnels today, with their ancient stone walls and echoing passages, one can imagine the empress moving through them in disguise. Inscriptions that suffered damnatio memoriae sometimes retain traces visible under modern imaging techniques. Partially effaced names can be reconstructed, revealing where Messalina's name once stood before stoneworkers chiseled it away. These ghostly presences in stone speak to both her power and her fall. Objects discovered in excavations, jewelry, pottery, coins, occasionally carry marks connecting them to years of her power. A ring bearing her image, a cup inscribed with dedications, a coin minted during her brief glory. These fragments survived the erasure, tiny windows into a deliberately forgotten past. The gardens of Lucullus, where she died, eventually became property of other emperors and lost their association with her. But botanical surveys suggest some ancient plantings survive, trees that were saplings when Messalina walked those grounds in her final hours. What does Messalina's story teach us today? Her specific circumstances, Roman empress in the 1st century AD, are unique, but underlying dynamics are timeless. Any society that concentrates power without adequate oversight creates opportunities for abuse. Any system that allows individuals to operate above the law invites exploitation. Any culture prioritizing authority over accountability risks enabling tyrants. Modern parallels exist in different forms. Cult leaders exploiting followers while claiming divine authority. Political figures using positions to prey on subordinates while maintaining public respectability. Corporate executives creating toxic cultures hidden behind professional facades. The scale and setting differ from ancient Rome, but the fundamental pattern, powerful individuals systematically exploiting those beneath them while evading accountability, remains consistent across time and place. Understanding Messalina's methods and eventual downfall may help societies better detect and respond to similar abuses before they become entrenched. Her story teaches that power corrupts most effectively when exercised in shadows. Compromising others creates leverage, but also creates enemies. Fear maintains control. Only temporarily. Systems built on blackmail eventually collapse. Individual courage matters, but requires collective action to succeed. Institutions designed to check power must actually be empowered to check it. Lost in historical fascination with Messalina herself are her countless victims. The young men coerced, the aristocrats humiliated and destroyed, the families who lost wealth and status, the officials forced to choose between integrity and survival. Ancient sources focus on Messalina as central character, treating victims as supporting players in her drama rather than as individuals with their own stories. We know names of some prominent victims: Valerius Asiaticus, Appius Silanus, but countless others remain anonymous, their suffering recorded only in vague references to the empress's various crimes. These forgotten victims remind us that behind every tyrant's legend are real people whose lives were shattered. Some found ways to resist, fleeing to provinces, confronting her directly despite the danger, choosing suicide over degradation. Their courage deserves remembering even though most of their names are lost to history. Claudius himself emerges as a tragic figure. Intelligent, capable in many areas of governance, yet unable or unwilling to confront his wife's activities until catastrophic betrayal made avoidance impossible. Was he victim or accomplice? The evidence suggests both. Victim of manipulation by someone more skilled at psychological warfare, but also complicit through willful ignorance, through prioritizing personal security over moral duty, through allowing fear of consequences to paralyze action. His asking at dinner why the empress hadn't joined him, either forgetting her execution or unable to process the reality, speaks to profound psychological damage. The realization of what had occurred in his palace, under his rule, with his implicit permission, may have broken something fundamental in him. Claudius lived 6 more years after Messalina's death, remarrying and continuing to rule. But ancient sources suggest he was never quite the same. The confident administrator occasionally visible in earlier years gave way to someone more cautious, more paranoid, more aware that trust could be catastrophically misplaced. Octavia and Britannicus, Messalina's children, were casualties of Roman politics and their mother's legacy. Octavia, married to Nero through Claudius's remarriage to Agrippina, found herself trapped in a toxic marriage to an increasingly unstable emperor. When Nero wanted to marry another woman, he fabricated adultery charges against Octavia and had her executed. She died young, her life destroyed by circumstances beyond her control. Britannicus, who should have been Claudius's heir by blood, was poisoned by Nero shortly after Claudius's death. Agrippina had maneuvered to place her own son on the throne, and Britannicus represented a threat. He died in his early teens, never given opportunity to prove what kind of ruler he might have become. Neither child bore personal responsibility for their mother's crimes. Yet both paid ultimate prices in a system where family connections meant everything, and being Messalina's offspring offered no protection, possibly even marked them as targets. Messalina's reign prompted attempts at reform, though their effectiveness was limited. Administrative procedures were tightened to make it harder for one person to control multiple power levers. Financial controls were implemented to prevent treasury looting without scrutiny. The Praetorian Guard was reorganized with new commanders and stricter oversight. The Senate attempted to assert more independence, having learned the dangers of complete subservience to the imperial family. Senators developed informal mechanisms for resisting imperial excesses without directly challenging the emperor, a delicate balance that sometimes worked and sometimes failed. But fundamental structural problems remained. Rome's imperial system still concentrated enormous power in the emperor and his family. If they chose to abuse that power, and if they were clever enough about it, stopping them remained extraordinarily difficult. The reforms represented lessons learned from the Messalina catastrophe, but they couldn't prevent all future abuses. Rome would endure many more corrupt and dangerous rulers, each demonstrating anew the system's vulnerabilities. The story you've just heard comes primarily from three ancient historians, Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio. Understanding their perspectives is crucial to evaluating their claims. Tacitus, writing around 110 AD, about 60 years after events, was Roman senator and historian who valued traditional morality and republican virtues. He viewed imperial system with skepticism and used figures like Messalina to illustrate its corrupting effects. His annals provide most detailed account of her reign. Suetonius, writing around the same period, served as imperial secretary with access to palace archives. His Lives of the 12 Caesars offers gossipy, scandal-focused narrative, but includes details that likely came from official records. Cassius Dio, writing a century later, was Greek senator who served in Rome. His Roman history provides another perspective, sometimes corroborating earlier sources, sometimes offering different interpretations. All three wrote in societies that viewed female power with suspicion. All three had moral and political reasons to emphasize Messalina's depravity. Modern historians must read critically, distinguishing between documented facts, probable truth, and possible exaggeration. Yet the core story, ambitious empress using sexual compromise as political weapon, corrupting institutions, finally destroyed by overreach, appears consistently across sources and aligns with contemporaneous documents and inscriptions, even accounting for bias and embellishment. Something extraordinary and terrible occurred during those 7 years. As evening falls over modern Rome, as tourists photograph the Forum and Palatine Hill unaware of the dramas that unfolded there, Messalina's story continues echoing across centuries. She teaches us that intelligence without empathy is dangerous, that power without accountability corrupts, that systems depending on virtue rather than structure eventually fail when virtuous people are replaced by those lacking moral restraints. She reminds us that civilization is fragile, that beneath law and order lie human impulses that can quickly overwhelm social structures if not carefully controlled. That institutional checks matter precisely because individual character is unreliable. She demonstrates that gender is no guarantee of behavior. Women can be as ruthlessly tyrannical as men when given power and opportunity. That patriarchy's claim that women are naturally more moral than men and need male control for their own protection is as false as the claim that women are naturally inferior. Messalina was neither inferior nor moral. She was human, with all that entails. And perhaps most importantly, she shows us that even seemingly invincible power built on fear and blackmail can collapse with stunning speed when it finally pushes too far. That tyranny contains seeds of its own destruction. That courage, even when it seems futile, matters because it creates networks of resistance that can mobilize when opportunity arises. 2,000 years have passed since Messalina walked Rome's streets, since she held court in the palace, since she died in the gardens with her mother weeping beside her. The stones she walked on lie beneath modern streets. The buildings she corrupted were torn down and rebuilt. The empire she nearly broke eventually fell to different forces, but her story survives, transmitted through centuries by historians, artists, writers, all trying to understand how such a person could exist and what her existence meant. She was brilliant and monstrous, strategic and impulsive, powerful and ultimately powerless against the systems she thought she controlled. She pushed boundaries until boundaries pushed back with fatal force. In the marble halls where emperors once ruled, in the underground passages where secrets were kept, in the gardens where execution came swiftly, Messalina's presence lingers not as ghost but as lesson, a reminder that power must be checked, that corruption spreads like disease, that silence in the face of evil becomes complicity, and that eventual accountability awaits even those who believe themselves beyond its reach. The empress who wanted to be remembered as goddess ended up remembered as cautionary tale. Not the immortality she sought, but perhaps the immortality she earned. Her name lives on, 2,000 years later, not in glory but as warning whispered across centuries. This is what happens when power meets amorality, when intelligence serves only selfishness, when fear replaces trust, and when silence allows evil to flourish. Rome survived Messalina. The question for every generation since has been, will we recognize such figures before it's too late? Will we find courage to resist when resistance seems dangerous? Will we build systems strong enough to check those who would corrupt them? Messalina's answer echoes from ancient Rome. Probably not, at least not until the cost becomes unbearable. But in that pessimistic answer lies slim hope. Eventually, somewhere, cost becomes too high. Eventually, tyranny overreaches. Eventually, resistance finds its moment. The empress fell. The empire survived, at least for a while longer, and her story endures, teaching uncomfortable truths to anyone willing to listen to whispers from Rome's deepest shadows.